The emergence of future-oriented cognition enabled humans to simulate events that were not occurring in the immediate environment. This cognitive development was not limited to planning or problem-solving. It altered how the brain interpreted uncertainty itself. Once the mind could construct internal models of potential danger, these imagined scenarios interacted with neural systems originally designed to detect real threats. As a result, hypothetical risks began to trigger responses similar to those produced by actual predators or hostile groups. Neuroscience research demonstrates that the same brain regions involved in processing present threats such as the amygdala, the superior colliculus and early visual pathways also respond to internally generated images of danger. When a situation is ambiguous, predictive processing networks attempt to fill in missing information. In ancestral environments, the safest assumption was that ambiguous cues indicated the presence of an agent. This bias, shaped by selective pressures, meant that a rustle in the grass or a shifting shadow was interpreted not as an abstract risk, but as a living entity with potential intent. As imagination grew more complex, the brain applied this agent detection tendency to internally simulated threats. A danger that existed only as a prediction could still activate mechanisms that normally respond to animate beings. Over time, this interaction produced a distinct perceptual effect, the sense that an unseen entity was observing or tracking human behavior. The brain was not malfunctioning. It was extending ancient survival mechanisms into a new cognitive domain made possible by future-oriented thought. Cognitive models show that when humans visualize a potential threat, the mental image becomes integrated into the predictive coding process. Rather than remaining a detached idea, it is processed as part of the environment. When the brain predicts that a potential threat has agency, the predicted agent acquires spatial and temporal properties. It is not merely imagined. It is treated as if it occupies a position relative to the individual. This interpretation creates the perception that something is present even when the senses cannot confirm it. Once the mind reached this stage, the perception of being watched did not require an external stimulus. It could arise from internally generated scenarios shaped by memory, uncertainty, and environmental cues. The combination of imagination, risk assessment, and evolutionary bias produced a new cognitive state, attributing observation to an unseen agent. This development laid the groundwork for subsequent symbolic behavior, as humans began giving form to the idea of an observer, whose presence was inferred rather than perceived. The tendency to perceive agents in ambiguous situations originates from a specialized evolutionary adaptation known as the hyperactive agency detection device, or HADD. This mechanism emerged long before Homo sapiens and is documented across multiple species that rely on vigilance for survival. Its primary function is to detect the presence of another organism when sensory information is incomplete. In ecological terms, agent detection represents a critical asymmetry. The cost of assuming an agent when none exists is small, while failing to detect a real predator can be fatal. Natural selection favored cognitive systems that err on the side of caution. HADD influences multiple sensory pathways. In vision, it increases sensitivity to patterns resembling bilateral symmetry, especially those approximating eye configurations. The human visual system allocates disproportionate processing power to faces and gaze direction, as evidenced by activation in the fusiform face area and the superior temporal sulcus. These regions respond not only to actual faces, but also to minimal cues, such as to dark spots aligned horizontally. Under low light conditions, flickering firelight exaggerates this effect. Irregularities on stone surfaces or vegetation can be misinterpreted as facial features because the visual system prioritizes rapid identification over accuracy. Auditory processing shows a similar bias. Sudden or unexplained noises activate threat evaluation circuits in the brainstem and amygdala. When multiple possible interpretations exist, HADD defaults to assuming that the sound originates from an animate source. This response is consistent with findings in behavioral ecology. Prey species often react strongly to ambiguous auditory cues as a precautionary strategy. Early humans inherited this bias, making them prone to interpret natural sounds such as wind, dripping water, or shifting debris as evidence of intentional movement. Environmental factors in prehistoric settings amplified HADD responses. Dense vegetation, uneven terrain, and limited illumination created conditions where sensory ambiguity was constant. Studies of predator-prey dynamics show that hominins in Africa and Eurasia were surrounded by large carnivores for hundreds of thousands of years. Under these pressures, overdetection of agents improved survival odds. The human brain internalized this pattern so deeply that it persisted even when immediate predator threats diminished. HADD also interacts with higher-level cognitive systems. Predictive processing frameworks demonstrate that when the brain encounters incomplete information, it attempts to reduce uncertainty by inferring a cause. If the predicted cause matches the template of an agent, brain regions associated with theory of mind activate, generating the impression of intentional observation. This interaction between low-level sensory bias and high-level inference explains why humans detect observers even in environments devoid of other individuals. Through this mechanism, ambiguous cues from shifting shadows to unstable acoustic reflections were frequently interpreted as signs of presence. HADD did not produce accurate representations of reality. It produced representations optimized for survival. The result was a cognitive landscape in which perceived observation arose naturally from the interaction between environment, sensory ambiguity, and evolutionary constraint. Prehistoric caves created sensory conditions that strongly influenced how early humans interpreted their surroundings. These environments combined unstable lighting, complex acoustics, and irregular geological features, factors known to increase perceptual ambiguity. Under such conditions, neural systems associated with agency detection became highly active, often generating the impression that another being was present even when no physical individual was nearby. Research on Paleolithic cave systems shows that light behaves inconsistently in enclosed, uneven spaces. When illuminated by torches or firebrands, walls produce moving shadows, highlights, and distortions. Geological formations, like cupules, niches, and protruding rock shapes, can resemble anatomical features when viewed in low, fluctuating light. Eye-like depressions, in particular, are common in limestone and volcanic formations. These shapes can trigger rapid face detection responses in the fusiform face area, giving the impression of gaze direction or attention. Studies of pareidolia in controlled conditions confirm that minimal cues such as two symmetrical dark spots are sufficient to activate neural pathways associated with social perception. Acoustic properties of caves further intensified these effects. Work by Igor Reznikov and other acoustic archaeologists demonstrates that many Paleolithic cave chambers possess strong reverberation characteristics. Sounds produced within them can return as echoes from multiple directions, reaching the listener with slight delays that resemble responsive vocalizations. In some chambers, specific tones resonate more powerfully, creating sustained vibrations. Early humans navigating these spaces would have encountered auditory feedback that appeared intentional, as if the environment reacted to their presence. This type of auditory ambiguity reinforces the perception of an observing entity. Material evidence indicates that ancient groups did not avoid these perceptually complex zones. Instead, they approached them deliberately. Archaeological deposits in deep cave sectors areas located hundreds of meters from natural light include pigments, torches, broken stalactite fragments, and carved markings. In Bernequal Cave, circular constructions made from broken stalagmites were built approximately 176,000 years ago. Such structures required coordinated effort and sustained presence in total darkness, suggesting that the space held significance beyond practical shelter or resource extraction. The distribution of Paleolithic art supports a similar interpretation. Many of the earliest images appear in chambers with pronounced echoes or visually striking natural formations. The placement of markings often integrates with existing shapes on the walls, enhancing features that resemble faces or eyes. This integration implies that prehistoric artists responded to the perceptual cues of the environment, reinforcing the impression that certain parts of the cave were associated with unseen agents. The combination of visual ambiguity, auditory response, and physical confinement created a setting where humans could easily interpret environmental stimuli as signs of observation. These sensory conditions, together with agency-prone neural mechanisms, shaped how prehistoric groups interacted with deep spaces. The cave environment acted as a catalyst, transforming ambiguous cues into perceived presence and providing a foundation for the symbolic responses that would develop later. Human behavior changes significantly when individuals believe that their actions are being monitored. This pattern is well documented in contemporary behavioral studies, showing that even minimal cues of observation, such as stylized eye images, directional gaze, icons, or surveillance-related symbols, can influence decision-making. The mechanism behind these changes is rooted in older neural systems that regulate social conduct. When an observer is inferred, whether real or imagined, individuals adjust their behavior to reduce conflict risk, maintain cooperative norms, and avoid actions that might carry social penalties. Research in evolutionary psychology suggests that sensitivity to observation conferred adaptive benefits in early human environments. For small foraging groups, reputation and social reliability had direct consequences for survival. Individuals who failed to cooperate in resource sharing or who engaged in harmful behavior faced potential exclusion, reduced support, and diminished access to group protection. A perceived observer, even if arising from ambiguous environmental cues, activated cognitive systems involved in evaluating one's own actions in relation to group expectations. This internal monitoring helped stabilize cooperation in contexts where explicit enforcement mechanisms did not exist. Neuroscience findings show that areas of the brain associated with self-regulation, including the medial prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, exhibit heightened activity when people believe they are being watched. These regions contribute to error monitoring, norm compliance, and social evaluation. The activation of these networks does not depend on the presence of an actual observer. It can be triggered by any cue that implies attention. In prehistoric contexts, the interpretation of cave echoes, is eye-like formations or movement in low light, would have provided sufficient stimuli to activate this system. Group dynamics were also influenced by inferred observation. When individuals believed that actions carried consequences beyond the immediate moment, they were more likely to participate in coordinated tasks, respect sharing rules, and avoid behaviors that might destabilize relationships. Anthropological studies of small-scale societies show that belief in watchful entities, whether ancestors, territorial spirits, or environmental forces, enhances rule adherence and reduces the incidence of antisocial acts. These patterns emerge even in groups without formal leadership structures, indicating that the perception of observation functions as an internalized regulatory mechanism. The effects extended to risk-related decisions. Activities with potential for high cost, such as hunting coordination or food storage maintenance, benefited from increased vigilance driven by the belief that failures might be noticed by an external presence. This additional layer of accountability encouraged more consistent performance and reduced variance in individual contributions. Over time, these behavioral tendencies strengthened group reliability, making collective action more predictable and resilient. As sensitivity to observation shaped decision-making at both the individual and group levels, it laid cognitive groundwork for more structured social expectations. The idea that behavior could be evaluated by an unseen presence became integrated into everyday interactions. This integration created an environment in which certain visual symbols, particularly those resembling eyes or attentive faces, gained importance as stable markers of implied oversight. Their emergence reflects the internalization of a concept already influencing conduct, that actions mattered beyond immediate physical observers. Archaeological evidence shows that eye-like motifs became one of the earliest recurring symbolic forms in prehistoric contexts. These motifs appear in Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe, in late Epipaleolithic assemblages of the Near East, and later in early Neolithic settlements. Their wide geographic range and chronological depth indicate that they emerged independently, shaped by shared cognitive tendencies rather than by direct cultural transmission. The pattern suggests that early humans consistently identified and reproduced shapes that resembled eyes because these forms aligned with deep neural sensitivities. The human visual system is highly specialized for detecting gaze. Regions such as the superior temporal sulcus and orbitofrontal cortex respond selectively to eye direction and to subtle variations in the configuration of eyelid and pupil. This sensitivity is rooted in social cognition. Gaze provides information about intention, threat level, and attention focus. Minimal configurations, typically too dark, circular marks within a larger outline, can activate these pathways even when the image lacks anatomical accuracy. This neural reactivity helps explain why eye-like patterns carved into stone or painted onto surfaces could carry substantial psychological weight. In many sites, these motifs occupy positions where they would be encountered during entry, passage, or activity. Examples include markings placed above thresholds, on elevated surfaces, or oriented toward communal areas. Their positioning suggests intentional placement rather than random decoration. Prehistoric groups appear to have situated these symbols in locations that already elicited agency-related interpretations, due to lighting, echo, or geological features. The addition of eye motifs amplified these effects, creating fixed indicators of attention within the environment. Some of the earliest abstract signs found at European cave sites, including Gravetian and Magdalenian contexts, incorporate oval or circular forms with central depressions. Although interpretations vary, the recurring structure parallels the basic geometry of an eye. Similar patterns occur in portable objects such as ivory plaques, antler carvings, and stone pendants. Their presence in portable items implies that the symbol's function extended beyond local cave conditions and was integrated into broader social or ritual practices. Ethnographic parallels provide insight into how such symbols functioned. In many small-scale societies, eye motifs serve as protective markers, boundary indicators, or reminders of unseen agents believed to monitor behavior. While prehistoric contexts cannot be directly equated with later ethnographic examples, the cross-cultural consistency suggests that eye symbols often operate as cues of observation. Their emergence likely reflects the internalization of perceived watchers described in earlier chapters, now reinforced through material representation. The earliest eye-like motifs, therefore, represent a shift from environmental illusions of monitoring to deliberate symbolic expression. By externalizing the concept of an observing presence, prehistoric groups created stable visual reminders that interacted with neural systems responsible for detecting attention. These symbols consolidated the idea of oversight within physical spaces, making the sense of observation more predictable and persistent. Their widespread distribution indicates that the cognitive foundations behind them were deeply rooted in the human mind, influencing both individual behavior and collective practices. As early humans repeatedly interpreted ambiguous cues as signs of an observing presence, these perceived watchers gradually acquired attributes beyond simple existence. The human brain is predisposed to infer intention whenever an agent is detected, even in cases where evidence is minimal. Neuroscientific studies show that regions involved in theory of mind such as the temporoparietal junction and medial prefrontal cortex activate automatically when the brain processes actions as goal-directed. Once a presence is assumed, these neural systems assign motives, expectations, and potential responses to it. This cognitive tendency is not restricted to interactions with other humans. Experiments in cognitive anthropology demonstrate that individuals regularly attribute intention to non-human entities, especially under uncertainty. Wind patterns, animal tracks, or unexplained sounds are often interpreted as purposeful acts rather than neutral events. These interpretations are more pronounced when the environment presents recurrent ambiguity, as would have been the case in prehistoric landscapes characterized by dense vegetation, low illumination, and limited sensory clarity. Archaeological evidence aligns with these cognitive patterns. Many early sites contain features suggesting that groups associated specific locations with entities possessing particular roles. In open-air contexts, unusual rock formations or vantage points show concentrations of artifacts, implying dedicated attention to those areas. In cave contexts, certain chambers appear repeatedly in symbolic practices, even when other areas of the cave offer easier access or better light. These patterns suggest that people interpreted certain zones as being occupied or controlled by non-visible agents. Comparative ethnographic data offer useful analogs. In a wide range of foraging societies, entities described as guardians of specific landscapes, mountains, rivers, forests, or caves are attributed with intentions related to protection, regulation, or punishment. These beings often monitor human behavior, respond to disruptions, or maintain balance within the environment. While caution is required when applying ethnographic models to Paleolithic contexts, the consistency across cultures indicates that attributing intention to unseen agents is a common human cognitive response, rather than a product of later organized religion. The development of intentional agents also reshaped how early humans interpreted causality. Events that lacked clear physical explanations could be connected to the motives of these inferred beings. Illness, failed hunts, sudden weather changes, and interpersonal conflicts could be interpreted as intentional outcomes rather than accidents. This shift reduced uncertainty by providing coherent explanations for unpredictable phenomena. By linking outcomes to agentive forces, communities created frameworks that allowed them to anticipate consequences and adjust their behavior accordingly. As these interpretations solidified, non-visible beings became integrated into collective memory and group identity. Generational transmission of stories, warnings, and place-based associations strengthened the perceived authority of these entities. The idea that an unseen agent could remember actions, reward cooperation or punish violations enhanced adherence to group norms. Intentionality, once inferred from ambiguous cues, evolved into a core feature of these unseen presences. Through this process, the concept of a watcher expanded from a perceptual byproduct into a structured cognitive model, a being with awareness, preferences, and influence. This development created the foundation upon which early spiritual and symbolic systems could emerge, linking environmental uncertainty with behavioral regulation in increasingly systematic ways. The belief that behavior is observed, even in the absence of a visible witness, produces measurable changes in social interaction. Studies in behavioral economics demonstrate that cues implying observation significantly increase cooperative choices, reduce dishonest actions, and promote adherence to shared rules. These effects arise from neural mechanisms originally developed to manage social reputation within small groups. In ancestral environments, reputation was a decisive factor in access to support, food sharing, and protection. An individual recognized as untrustworthy or disruptive risked exclusion, which could reduce survival prospects. Prehistoric communities operated under similar constraints. Cooperation in tasks, such as coordinated hunting, plant processing, or shelter construction, required predictable behavior. When ambiguous environmental cues were interpreted as signs of an observing presence, individuals adjusted their conduct to align with group norms. This adjustment did not depend on formal punishment systems. Instead, it reflected internalized expectations that actions carried consequences beyond immediate interpersonal reactions. Such psychological pressures likely increased consistency in resource sharing, contributed to more stable mobility decisions, and improved collective responses to external threats. Ethnographic studies of small-scale societies provide supporting parallels. Groups that maintain beliefs in watchful ancestors, territorial spirits, or invisible custodians show higher levels of norm adherence, even when external enforcement is minimal. These beliefs influence decision-making in contexts involving honesty, fairness, and long-term obligations. Although prehistoric groups left no written accounts, the underlying cognitive processes are widely considered universal across human populations. When individuals assume that behavior is monitored, self-regulation increases, reducing the frequency of actions that generate conflict or endanger group cohesion. Neuroscientific evidence helps explain this phenomenon. Perceived observation activates brain regions involved in social evaluation and conflict avoidance. Activity in the medial prefrontal cortex supports reflection on one's own actions, while the anterior cingulate cortex monitors potential errors or violations. These areas respond not only to actual eyes but also to symbolic representations and inferred agents. Because prehistoric environments frequently produced stimuli that triggered agency detection, these neural circuits were likely engaged during routine activities, reinforcing patterns of cautious and cooperative behavior. This cognitive model influenced broader social organization. When people believed that behavior mattered to entities beyond the immediate group, it created conditions in which collective norms could persist, even during periods of environmental stress. Predictability in behavior improved coordination during migrations, seasonal gathering, or group-based hunting strategies. Shared expectations anchored in perceived oversight provided a framework for evaluating deviations, encouraging individuals to maintain consistent contributions over time. The stabilizing role of inferred observation contributed to early forms of social structure. Responsibilities within groups became more clearly defined, as actions that were believed to carry consequences motivated individuals to fulfill obligations. Disputes could be interpreted not only in terms of interpersonal harm but also as disturbances affecting the balance maintained by unseen forces. This interpretation helped maintain order in the absence of formal leadership or codified rules. By regulating behavior through internalized monitoring, invisible oversight fostered conditions that supported more complex symbolic and ritual practices. When people acted as though their decisions were evaluated by non-physical agents, the transition toward dedicated spaces for interaction with these agents became an increasingly coherent extension of existing cognitive patterns. Evidence from Paleolithic archaeology indicates that deep cave environments served functions distinct from ordinary habitation. These locations are often situated far beyond the reach of natural light, requiring deliberate navigation through narrow passages and uneven terrain. Despite the difficulty and risk associated with accessing these zones, early humans repeatedly visited them, leaving behind materials that point to structured activities rather than incidental occupation. Such behavior suggests that deep caves held significance as settings where interactions with non-visible forces were perceived to occur. The spatial distribution of artifacts provides the clearest indication of intentional use. Pigment residues, torch fragments, and deliberately placed stones appear in chambers located dozens or even hundreds of meters from cave entrances. At sites such as Chauvet, Altamira, and Trois Frères, hand stencils, engraved surfaces, and charcoal markings occur primarily in the deepest sections, rather than in areas that would be practical for daily life. These material traces indicate that people carried resources into these zones for specific purposes. The separation of these activities from domestic contexts implies a conceptual distinction between everyday spaces and areas associated with symbolic or experiential practices. Lighting conditions in deep caves amplified perceptual phenomena linked to the sense of presence. Firelight behaves unpredictably in enclosed spaces, producing dynamic shadows that interact with natural rock formations. Geological features in deep chambers often include protrusions and depressions that can evoke human or animal forms under fluctuating illumination. These sensory effects align with cognitive mechanisms that detect agency, increasing the likelihood that individuals would interpret the environment as inhabited by unseen beings. The repeated selection of such environments indicates that these perceptual characteristics were not incidental, but integral to the experiences sought within them. Acoustic properties further shaped how people interpreted these spaces. Many chambers exhibit pronounced reverberation, causing footsteps, voices, or tool strikes to generate complex echo patterns. Research in acoustic archaeology has shown that resonant zones within caves frequently correspond with areas containing art or other symbolic modifications. The sound reflections in these chambers can resemble vocal responses or movement from surrounding walls, encouraging the interpretation of the cave as an actively responsive agent. Such feedback would reinforce the perception that communication with non-visible entities was occurring. Structural modifications in deep caves also point to purposeful activity. The ring-like construction made from broken stalagmites in Bruniquel Cave, dated to approximately 176,000 years ago, suggests a level of organized behavior carried out in complete darkness. The placement and arrangement of these fragments indicate deliberate construction by multiple individuals. While the exact purpose remains debated, the location deep within the cave strongly implies a non-utilitarian function consistent with interaction with imagined entities or symbolic practices. Taken together, the environmental features, acoustics, and material evidence indicate that deep caves operated as dedicated zones, where early humans engaged with forces perceived to exist outside normal sensory boundaries. These spaces provided physical contexts in which experiences of presence, agency, and response were intensified. Over time, repeated interaction within such environments likely contributed to formalizing concepts of non-visible beings, strengthening the cognitive link between specific locations and perceived external powers. As repeated encounters with ambiguous sensory cues accumulated, early humans began assigning increasingly structured attributes to the non-visible agents they believed inhabited particular locations. These attributes reflected cognitive tendencies already active in human social life. The same mechanisms used to infer motives, expectations, and emotional states in other people were applied to unseen beings. Theory of mind systems, once triggered, supported the construction of agents capable of remembering actions, evaluating behavior, and producing outcomes interpreted as intentional. Evidence for this conceptual expansion appears indirectly in archaeological patterns. Certain cave chambers, rock shelters, and high vantage points are associated with repeated visits over long periods, despite offering no practical advantages for habitation or resource extraction. The persistence of activity in these locations indicates that groups attributed ongoing significance to them. In many cases, symbolic markings accumulate over multiple occupational horizons, suggesting that the area was thought to be inhabited or influenced by a stable, non-human presence. The consistency of use implies that people regarded these spaces as belonging to entities with continuity across generations. Comparative anthropology provides further context. Many small-scale societies describe non-visible beings not as abstract deities, but as specific figures tied to identifiable landscapes. These beings enforce behavioral boundaries, protect essential resources, or punish violations that threaten group stability. Such roles emerge naturally when intentionality is projected onto environmental forces. Events like sudden storms, hunting failures or illness become interpretable as purposeful acts rather than random occurrences. This interpretive framework reduces uncertainty by providing causal explanations in environments where outcomes can be difficult to predict. The earliest conceptual agents were likely limited in scope. Their influence was confined to particular places, events, or situations. Archaeological contexts support this view. Symbolic actions tend to cluster in discrete zones rather than being distributed uniformly across landscapes. Deep cave chambers might be associated with one type of entity, while prominent rock formations or springs could correspond to others. The segmentation reflects a developmental stage in which supernatural figures were linked to local features, before evolving into broader, more abstract categories. Over time, the inferred capacities of these beings expanded. As humans observed correlations between their behavior and environmental outcomes, they interpreted these patterns through the lens of intentional oversight. Regular success in cooperative activities could be taken as evidence of favor, while misfortune reinforced the idea of disapproval. Through repeated attribution, the non-visible agents became integrated into decision-making processes. Actions were undertaken with the expectation that they would elicit responses from these observers. Social cohesion benefited from these beliefs. When group members assumed that their behavior was monitored by agents with the ability to reward or punish, adherence to norms increased. Stability in areas such as food sharing, conflict resolution, and seasonal movement was enhanced by the shared understanding that violations carried consequences beyond interpersonal relationships. This cognitive structure provided a foundation for early narrative traditions, in which stories about specific beings reinforced communal expectations. With these developments, supernatural entities acquired defined roles that extended beyond perceptual illusions. They became part of the conceptual system through which early humans understood their environment, regulated behavior, and interpreted unpredictable events. This transition marked a significant step in the evolution of symbolic thought, setting the groundwork for more complex ritual practices and explanatory frameworks that would develop later. As unseen agents became firmly embedded in early human cognition, the interpretive framework surrounding them grew more elaborate. Individuals no longer viewed ambiguous events as isolated occurrences. Instead, outcomes across daily life were linked to the actions and evaluations of these inferred entities. This created a unified explanatory model where environmental shifts, interpersonal conflicts, and fluctuations in resource availability could be interpreted as responses, originating outside the visible world. Such interpretations reduced cognitive uncertainty by offering consistent explanations for unpredictable conditions. Environmental phenomena that lacked clear physical causes were especially likely to be incorporated into this system. Severe weather, sudden darkness, unusual animal behavior, and geological disturbances often fell into categories that stimulated heightened vigilance. When these events coincided with moments of social tension or collective stress, they reinforced the belief that non-visible agents were sending signals or enforcing boundaries. The human brain's strong orientation toward pattern detection intensified this process. Correlations, even when accidental, provided sufficient material for attributing meaning and intentionality to events beyond human control. The memory systems involved in predator detection contributed to this emerging interpretive structure. Neural circuits designed to store and recall information about threats, particularly those involving sudden movement or loud auditory cues, remained active even as physical dangers decreased in frequency. These circuits generalized their responses to non-predatory stimuli, including storms, rockfalls, or loud environmental sounds. Because these reactions originated in ancient survival mechanisms, they carried a degree of urgency and significance that encouraged symbolic interpretation. The association between fear responses and natural phenomena created fertile ground for connecting environmental signals with the intentions of unseen beings. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the earliest symbolic motifs reflect this cognitive pattern. Repeated depictions of lightning-like lines, branching forms, and radiating patterns appear in Paleolithic and early Holocene contexts. These images are often interpreted as abstract designs, but their resemblance to electrical discharges and storm-related visual effects indicates a possible link to early attempts at representing impactful atmospheric events. The recurring presence of such motifs across unrelated regions points to a shared cognitive response, rather than a specific cultural transmission. As early humans integrated these interpretations into collective behavior, their explanatory systems expanded accordingly. The unseen agents once associated primarily with caves or specific locations began to be linked with broader natural forces. Thunder, darkness. The behavior of large predators and sudden changes in the landscape were increasingly conceptualized as expressions of intentional power. This shift did more than interpret the environment. It provided models that shaped social norms, guided decision-making, and influenced movement patterns. Communities began to respond to natural signals with coordinated actions, often designed to avoid perceived danger or restore balance. The growing integration between fear responses and symbolic meaning marked a pivotal shift in cognitive evolution. Observed events no longer existed purely as physical occurrences. They became part of a larger system in which environmental signals carried implications for group safety, social behavior, and future outcomes. This conceptual expansion laid the foundation for more complex relationships between fear, imagination, and cultural development. As these interpretations solidified, they set the stage for a deeper transformation, the emergence of ancient fears that operated not only as survival mechanisms, but as organizing principles. These fears would soon shape settlement choices, ritual behavior, and early collective identities, forming some of the earliest structural elements of human civilization. Echoes of Sapiens. If stories like this remind you what it means to be human, subscribe and keep exploring with us.